Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. G'day folks, and welcome to episode 68 of the podcast, recorded on the 14th of April 2024. This is the first of 5 episodes that have been made in partnership with History Guild. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be the time that I would send you to check out our website or web store to pick up one of our awesome morale patches or look at show notes and photos of memorials dotted across Australia. But instead, this time I recommend you check out historyguild.org and check out one of the hundreds of articles dedicated to educating people about Australia's contributions to battles in Greece, Crete, and Malta. And to that end, join me now as I give you part 1 of the life, service, and legacy of an officer who served in both the Greece and Crete campaigns, William Holmes Travers. William Holmes Travers was born on the 9th of November 1915 in Neutral Bay, New South Wales. Known as Bill to his family, he was the eldest son to Lieutenant Colonel Reginald Travers and Dorothy Holmes, the daughter of Colonel William Holmes, whom William Travers was named in honour of. Colonel William Holmes was the commander of the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force and later served with distinction as part of the 4th Division, 1st Australian Imperial Force, and served on Gallipoli and the Western Front. Sadly, Major General Holmes would be killed before he could meet his namesake. Bill Travers would only come to know his father after the cessation of hostilities in the Great War. Not long after his father's return, the family would be expanded to include a brother, Basil Holmes Travers, named in honour of his uncle, born in 1919. After the First World War, the Travers family would settle in the coastal suburb of Bondi in New South Wales, where Travers and his brother would attend the Sydney Church of England Grammar School, quickly distinguishing themselves as scholars, athletes, and leaders, ascending to the ranks of senior prefects while demonstrating prowess both in the classroom and on the sporting fields. In both would follow in the family business by joining the cadets. As a result of the Munich crisis in 1938, Bill Travers would join the militia and reach the rank of lieutenant that year. Following his schooling, Travers worked as a salesman at Lever Brothers, an industrial indent agent. Indent agents are salesmen who act on behalf of a seller and charges a commission to sell their products. Traditionally, it had referred to the tea trade or the sale of raw materials, though today it's generally associated with real estate. For Travers, he sold industrial soaps. While there, he also studied at night at the University of Sydney, studying economics. He received his Bachelor of Economics in 1939 while at the university and joined the University of Sydney Regiment. He also received the coveted blue or first grade jacket in rugby union in 1937. Now, for my American listeners, this is the equivalent of him lettering in rugby. At the outbreak of the Second World War, it is of no surprise that both men were quick to answer the call to arms, enlisting in the second raising of the Australian Imperial Force. Bill signed up on the 16th of October 1939 in Bondi, and Basil on the 27th of November in Paddington. Interestingly though, despite the latter enlistment date, Basil's service number is lower than Bill's. This is owing to the allocation numbers to different regions within the military district. While Bill received the low NX number of NX57, Basil would receive NX17. William Holmes, Bill Travers' transition from salesman to soldier was swift and resolute, as he embarked on his military journey upon entering the Ingleburn training camp. He would be taken on strength as an original member of the 2nd 1st Australian Infantry Battalion when it was raised at Victoria Barracks in Sydney on the 4th of November, and owing to his previous military experience, he was swiftly gazetted as a lieutenant on the 30th of November 1939 and appointed as a platoon commander in No. 4 Company. During his training, he also was routinely served as an orderly officer to the battalion. Now, you may recall from my various naval episodes commenting that the Navy had a habit of naming their military installations the same name. Well, it wasn't just the Navy who did this. Every state on the east coast of Australia named their Army headquarters Victoria Barracks as well. The impact of the Great Depression on Australian industry, coupled with a succession of slashed military procurement budgets and a prevailing anti-war sentiment amongst the sons of Great War veterans, meant there was little room for expansion or modernisation of the peacetime forces, nor was there a stockpile of weapons to raise a volunteer force to serve overseas. And as a result, the unit trained using the weapons and equipment surplus to what Travers' father and grandfather would have used 20 years prior in the Great War. The following month, Travers would marry Jean Margaret Evelyn Mackay, the daughter of the commander of the 6th Australian Division, Major General Ivan Mackay, who was a student advisor at the University of Sydney before becoming the headmaster of the once prestigious Cranbrook School on the 22nd of December 1939. The couple had met while at university. She was studying arts while he was studying economics, and they would be married in North Sydney with a reception being held in the Cranbrook School. Their honeymoon would be interrupted as 3 weeks later, Travers and the rest of the 6th Division would board troop ships bound for the Middle East at the start of the new year, with Travers and the rest of the 2nd 1st Battalion boarding the troop ship HMT U5 Orford. The troop ships laden with soldiers and supplies from ports spanning Australia and New Zealand converged at Fremantle before setting sail for Egypt under the protective watch of the naval escort led by the British battleship HMS Ramillies alongside the Australian cruisers HMAS Australia and Canberra. Their journey mirrored the historic convoys of the First World War, and they were destined for similar shores. After stopping in Colombo to take on supplies and fuel, the convoy continued on to the Red Sea, finally putting into El Kantara on the Suez Canal on the 13th of February. For the journey, Travers would serve on the battalion's sports committee, which, considering his athletic acclaim, made perfect sense. He would also rotate within his battalion as an officer of the guard and orderly throughout the voyage. From El Kantara, the 2nd 1st boarded trains to Gaza, finally entering the camp at Julius in eastern Palestine, where they encamped with the venerable Black Watch. Interestingly, the legacy of the conduct of Australian forces in Cairo in the previous war cast a long shadow over their presence in the region, and prompted the Egyptian government to insist that the Australian troops be relocated outside of their territory for training. Now, this is despite the fact they were mandated to defend the Suez Canal. Not long after Travers arrived in Egypt, he would be joined by his wife, who was employed as part of the Australian Comforts Fund and the Australian Red Cross. She would later go on to be employed as a cipher and censor at AIF headquarters in Palestine, and when he would be permitted to go on leave, he would spend that time with her. And when the 2nd and 1st trained, they continued to do so with the same Great War vintage weaponry and often in the same camps their predecessors trained in. As unfortunately, events occurring in Europe caused promised supplies from England to not arrive, as they had been reallocated to home defence following the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. Midway through February, the 2nd 1st was chosen to provide the first ever AIF Guard of Honour held abroad for a reception held for Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Wavell of Middle Eastern Command. Travers was selected to be officer commanding of the 2nd Contingent, and this Guard of Honour was complimented by General Wavell for their bearing and turnout. In March, he represented the AIF along with his brother Basil, who had joined the 2nd Battalion, in an AIF vs the Rest representative rugby union game where he played breakaway. Now, I very rarely get to draw on this resource, but a breakaway is a player on the side or flank of a scrum, called such as they would be the first to break away from the scrum when the ball was in play or chase down the opposition player who had it. Thanks, Dad. From the 12th to the 24th of May, Travers was posted to the Palestine Recruits Training Depot at Sarafand, the location of the largest British military base in the Middle East. He would return to his battalion while it was undertaking in desert warfare training, focusing in infantry tactics and operations to counter enemy armour. On the 23rd of July, he'd be sent to the Middle Eastern Tactical School in Abassa in Cairo to undertake the company commander's course, and while there, he'd be admitted to the 4th New Zealand General Hospital with a case of bronchitis. After 6 days' treatment, he would return to training and eventually return to the 2nd 1st on the 24th of September. 2 days later, the 2nd 1st Battalion arrived at a Kingi Marriott outside Alexandria and entered camp following the Kingdom of Italy's entrance into the war on the side of the Axis powers and their crossing of the Egyptian-Libyan border with 215,000 troops on the 9th of September. This force initially made impressive gains in a relatively short time in concert with land invasions of Kenya, Sudan, and British Somaliland before the Italian Viceroy, the Duke of Aosta, ordered his troops to halt and fortify their positions on the 16th. In doing so, he immediately handed the initiative to Lieutenant General Archibald Wavell of Middle Eastern Command. This delay also allowed the still very inexperienced Australian Imperial Force a further chance to train. By November, the 2nd 1st had been relocated to Amaria in Alexandria as the entire 6th Division participated in a 3-day exercise around the town of Burq el Arib starting on the 20th of November. Compared to the experience of Captain Ralph Horner in the 19th Australian Infantry Brigade, who was defending Burq El Arib and the focus of episodes 47 to 49 and Season 3, Travers, who was now serving as second in command of C Company under Captain Walter Dillon, and the rest of the 2nd First, on the other hand, served as part of the 16th Australian Infantry Brigade and was tasked with capturing it. However, for this exercise, the 2nd First were operating in Brigade Reserve. Following this exercise, Travers and his brother would be selected for rugby exhibition matches in Cairo against the Officer to Cadet Training Unit and the Combined Headquarters Middle East on the 6th to 8th December. Sadly, no records exist of how well the RAF team performed in these matches. On the 9th of December 1940, the considerably smaller Western Desert Force under the command of General Wavell launched Operation Compass. This was a 5-day raid on Italian positions led by Major General Richard O'Connor at the head of a force of 36,000 men, 275 tanks, or 120 guns and 142 aircraft against the Italian fortifications in occupied Egypt. The British 7th Armoured Division and the 4th Indian Division were instrumental in this initial phase and attacked the Italian positions at Sidi Barrani, delivering a stunning defeat to the Italian forces. The position was captured and 38,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner, the first of some 130,000 Italians who would end up being captured during the raid and subsequent British advance. As the remnants of Italian forces retreated across the border back into Libya, the 7th Armoured Division established itself to the west of Bardia, cutting off land communications between the strong Italian garrison there and Tobruk, 96 kilometers away. On the 11th of December, the 4th Indian Division was withdrawn from the Western Desert Force and sent to the Sudan to participate in the East African Campaign. And in response, the 16,000-strong 6th Australian Division under Lieutenant Travers' father-in-law, Major General Ivan Mackay, was brought forward from Egypt. Now, this is despite it being under-equipped, largely inexperienced, and according to some senior officers in both the Australian and British commands, incredibly undertrained. Despite these obstacles, the 6th Division was immediately put into the line on the British right flank and was about to experience its baptism of fire in a tiny village on the Egyptian-Libyan border called Bardia, in what would become the Australian Army's first action of the Second World War, despite the fact the Royal Australian Navy and Royal Australian Air Force had already been conducting operations since 1939. Located in the Libyan region of Cyrenaica, Bardia is roughly 30 kilometers from the Egyptian border, which, following Italy's colonization of the region, became a fortified outpost with a 29-kilometer-long string of defensive outposts, barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and trenches around the town and its small harbour. To quote Major Henry Marshall from the 6th Division, quote, "The Italians had spent a number of years developing Bardia and they considered it impregnable. They had made the terrain inside and outside the wire as bald as a billiard ball and had constructed concrete posts along the wire in 2 rows. It was impossible to use any cover as there wasn't any," unquote. The Australian official historian for the Second World War, Gavin Long, also described it as, quote, "a great expense in labour, steel and concrete. They had dug a defensive line in the form of an arc 18 miles in length round the little harbour in Garrison Town. They consisted of an almost continuous anti-tank ditch, behind it a double line of underground posts, the front line being linked by rows of barbed wire. The posts in the forward line were generally about 800 yards apart and were protected by their own anti-tank trench. They were armed with 1 or 2 47mm guns and from 1 to 4 machine guns. The guns were fired from concrete-sided pits connected by trenches with deep underground shelter, which preoccupied most of the area of the post. 400 yards behind the forward line lay a second arc of posts, similar but lacking an anti-tank trench and sometimes without wire. Within this perimeter, aerial photography revealed a considerable array of artillery, estimated at 110 guns, and some long stone breastworks. Each flank of the line lay on the inner bank of one of the steep-sided wadis carved into the cliffs forming the coast from the Saloum northwards, but otherwise the posts were all in flat, almost featureless ground, offering little cover to an attacker and few landmarks, unquote. While the men of the 6th Division may have been inexperienced, the men in charge of the brigades and divisions were all well-experienced officers from the Great War, and they knew the ins and outs of attacking an entrenched, fortified opponent, with all seeing extensive service on Gallipoli and the Western Front in battalion and brigade-level commands. The plan, orchestrated by General Mackay, called for Brigadier General Arthur Tubby Allen's 16th Australian Infantry Brigade to attack the western side of Bardia's defences, supported by 23 Matilda tanks of the British 7th Royal Tank Regiment, with Brigadier General Stanley Savage's 17th Australian Infantry Brigade in position ready to exploit the breakout. While the 3rd Brigade of the division, the 19th, under Major General Horace Robertson, was in divisional reserve. These men would also be supported from the sea by the inshore squadron commanded by Royal Australian Navy officer Captain Hector MacDonald Laws Waller, the focus of episode 32, and in the air by elements of No. 3 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, commanded by squadron leader Peter St. George Bruce Turnbull, the focus of episode 12. Now, British and Australian intelligence sources estimated that the Italian fortress contained about 25,000 soldiers. The Australian attack was going to be measured against the superb combat record of the 1st Australian Imperial Force, and the initial results were stunning. On the 3rd of January 1941, C&D companies of the 2nd 1st, the designated assault troops, ate breakfast and took their tot of rum before entering the line at 0416. At 0530, under the thunder of 900 artillery pieces, the leading platoons and sappers of the 16th Brigade approached the Italian positions equipped with Bangalore torpedo devices packed with ammonol and destroyed the first line of barbed wire at a junction between two Italian battalions. This decision caused confusion amongst the Italian forces as the balance of the 2nd 1st sprang to their feet and attacked the Italian defences with gusto, destroying anti-tank ditches with shovels and pickaxes. Within half an hour, the frontline posts had been taken and the Australian forces were rapidly making their way inland. In rapid succession, 6 additional tank ditches had been rendered inoperable, minefields identified, and wire emplacements marked for the 23 Matilda tanks entering the battle alongside the 2nd Australian Infantry Battalion. This force would wheel right along the outpost line and continue the attack. At 0750, the 2nd 3rd Battalion, supported by Universal carriers, entered the fray and made their way towards Bardia, punching through the remaining defences. By 0920, the 16th Brigade had reached their objectives, and despite a valiant but ultimately futile Italian counterattack, by midday, 6,000 Italian prisoners had been taken. Their perimeter had been breached, and the Australians were not about to be dislodged. Within an hour of the attack commencing, however, Captain Dillian was severely wounded in the legs, necessitating Travers to assume command of C Company. The battle resumed on the 4th, with the 2nd 1st continuing their advance towards posts to the north of Bardia, with lead elements coming under heavy machine gun fire, which initially slowed the advance. However, the support from British artillery managed to punch a hole in the Italian lines. By 4 p.m, the C Company had captured their main objective of the main Bardia road. And within the hour, the northern Italian positions had collapsed, most without firing a single shot. To quote the unit diary, quote, 1730, impossible to count number of prisoners taken by the battalion during the last 2 days. At least 10,000, unquote. All that remained of the Italian front line was a handful of outposts to the extreme north of Bardia defensive line, but they'd been cut off from their headquarters and support. The final capture of Bardia would be conducted by the 19th Australian Infantry Brigade, as covered in my Ralph Honock episodes, but by the end of the 5th of January, the port of Bardia had fallen to Australian forces, who had, according to war correspondent John Hetherington, quote, men who'd since childhood had read and heard of the exploits of the 1st Australian Imperial Force, who had enlisted and trained under the shadow of their father's reputation as soldiers, had come through their ordeal of fire and built a reputation of their own, unquote. American newspapers covering the battle praised the action of the Australians with headlines such as, quote, hardy, wild-eyed Aussies called world's finest troops, unquote, and running stories that told its readers that the Australians, quote, in their realistic attitude towards power politics, prefer to send their boys to fight far overseas than fighting a battle in the suburbs of Sydney, unquote. Anecdotally, Bardia and the following actions would also prove invaluable to the United States government in getting the Lend-Lease Act enacted. With the capture of Bardia, General Richard O'Connor, commander of 13 Corps, which was the renamed Western Desert Force, under instruction from General Wavell, set his sights on the capture of Tobruk and its deep-water port, which at the time was the only deep-water port in eastern Libya. Now, the distance between the main Allied port and resource centre of Alexandria and the front line at this point was some 665 kilometres, and this meant that supplying British troops by land convoy was a slow and arduous process. Most vehicles of the time maxed out at about 33.79 kilometers per hour and faced challenging terrain without any access to proper roads. This meant that a single truck containing food, fuel, ammunition, or reinforcements would take close to a full day to reach the front line. Despite the durability and range of British lorries, there was a critical shortage of these vehicles, which even supplementing with the use of captured Italian vehicles could not resolve. The capture of Tobruk and its port would address these logistical challenges by enabling Allied forces to transport supplies and reinforcements directly by sea from Alexandria. Now, resupply by sea wouldn't necessarily speed up the process, with cargo ships of the era making the voyage in about the same time. They could more effectively resupply the front line than any land convoy, and in doing so free up much needed fuel. By securing Tobruk, General O'Connor aimed to establish a more efficient and reliable supply chain for Allied forces, thereby enhancing their operational effectiveness and ability to sustain prolonged military operations in the North African theatre. This strategic objective was mirrored in the latter actions of German General Erwin Rommel, who also recognized the importance of Tobruk's port in facilitating logistical support of his own military offensive in the region later in the year. Now, much like Bardia, the Kingdom of Italy had fortified Tobruk in its deepwater port with 128 concreted underground posts protected by barbed wire entanglements spread along a semicircle about 48 kilometers long. The same perimeter at Bardia had contained 80 posts spread over 27 kilometers. The terrain around Tobruk, like Bardia, was flat, featureless, and sloped towards the coast, and was dotted with ravines. Now, Allied intelligence had greatly underestimated the strength of the Italian defenders at Bardia, speculating only 25,000 troops were present, and when in reality, the number was closer to 40,000. With now the majority of these troops in Allied custody as prisoners of war, new intelligence revealed that another 25,000 personnel defended Tobruk. Furthermore, it became apparent that 8 of Italy's 9 divisions in the theatre were either decimated or captured, leaving Tobruk with a significant but isolated garrison facing the advancing Allied forces. 2 days following the capture of Bardia, the 16th Brigade took up positions to the west of Tobruk, with the 17th Brigade in reserve positions as the 19th continued mopping up operations around Bardia. However, due to concerns about the viability of further offensive operations as the positioning had exhausted what remained of stockpiles of supplies the Western Desert Force had, including what was captured from the Italians, Major General O'Connor ordered a halt until more supplies could be brought forward, which meant the attack on Tobruk didn't happen until the 21st of January. This plan was also underpinned with instructions from London that a halt to the Western advance may be called on at any point due to changing operational requirements in other theatres of the war. This autumn, I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, has partnered with History Guild to bring you a series of episodes dedicated to telling the life, service and legacy of 4 Australians of the tens of thousands who served in the Mediterranean theatre during the Second World War, playing a vital role in that theatre. History Guild has created this project so more Australians can discover the stories of service and sacrifice of the Australians who fought there and honour them by visiting these battlefields. The History Guild website, historyguild.org, has guides to help people visit and understand the battlefields in Greece, Crete and Malta. So thanks, History Guild, for the support. Let's get back to the show. This added pressure to O'Connor to not only capture Tobruk, but also the Libyan capital of Benghazi, potentially with only the forces he had available, namely the 2nd and 7th British Armoured Divisions, the 6th Australian Division and the New Zealand Brigade Group, which, augmented with British troops that were arriving, could re-raise to divisional strength. Now this is despite him potentially requiring 3 times the number of men to accomplish this objective. For Tobruk, the plan called for the now depleted 7th Armoured Division and the 6th Australian Division to attack Tobruk from the south, using superior British artillery to suppress the Italian garrison long enough for the 16th Brigade to break through with the 19th Brigade, which had intentionally been kept out of the Bardia attack, on hand to exploit the gains. From midnight on the 21st of January, the monitor HMS Terror, along with 3 vessels of Captain Hector MacDonald Laws Waller's 10th Destroyer Flotilla, bombarded Tobruk Harbour, before the position was attacked by forces from the Royal Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force, including elements of No. 3 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, though by accounts, Squadron Leader Peter St George Bruce Turnbull was not present. All went according to plan, with the First World War vintage Italian guns no match for the superior range and efficacy of the British 25-pounder. At dawn on the 21st of January, the 16th Brigade launched their attack, with the 2nd 1st and 2nd 3rd Battalions, the latter being supported by Matilda tanks, despite sustaining minor casualties, forced a breach in the Italian line, which allowed the 2nd 2nd, plus the remaining Matilda tanks of the 7th Armoured, to punch through with all 3 battalions securing their objectives by midday. This rapid advance allowed the 19th Brigade to move through the 16th positions and advance a further 5,000 yards. And under the support of 78 British guns, they took their own objective. The 19th Brigade eventually captured the aerodrome at Tobruk, with the garrison surrendering to 19th Brigade's General Horace Robertson the following day. Despite Italian forces trying to conduct a scorched earth operation on Tobruk, they only focused on stores, not installations, and this allowed the port to be reopened for Allied use 2 days after the city fell. As General O'Connor capitalized on the collapse of the Italian army in North Africa, pushed on towards Benghazi with the rest of the 6th Division, the 2nd 1st and Travers was tasked with occupation duty on Tobruk, and in November he was promoted to captain, officer commanding C Company. While on garrison duty in Tobruk in early February, the 2nd 1st formed a guard of honour for the visiting Australian Prime Minister, the Honourable Sir Robert Menzies, who was on his way to England to discuss the next phase of the war with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, as the developing situation in the Balkans was dominating the topic of conversation. For historical context, back in April 1939, the Kingdom of Italy annexed Albania and turned it into a puppet protectorate as part of their own imperial aspirations. This move immediately soured relations between Italy and Greece, who now shared a border. Greece had its independence guaranteed by both France and Britain, which everyone hoped would be enough to maintain the status quo between the two countries. However, when France fell to Germany in May 1940, Italy in turn focused its attention on fighting the British in Africa, hoping for a similar collapse of forces there. However, as I've already mentioned, that really hadn't gone according to plan. Even as this was happening, Mussolini issued an ultimatum to Greece to cede undisclosed Greek strategic points to Italy, or there would be a state of war between them. As to be expected, Greece understandably refused. Once the ultimatum had been received, the Greek government entered into talks with their British counterparts and enacted that independence guarantee, who on the 22nd of October 1940 instructed the RAF Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief Middle East, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Longmore, to order RAF squadrons in Egypt and Malta to prepare for sorties in support of Greek operations. As a result of Greece rejecting the ultimatum, on the 28th of October 1940, Italian forces crossed the Albanian frontier. Now, despite his own generals warning Mussolini against the invasion due to lack of preparedness, El Duce had only given his generals less than 2 weeks to mobilize, equip, and transport the invasion forces from across Italian territorial holdings to the Albanian frontier. Coupled with the fact that the invasion would coincide with the rainy season and would force Italian troops to fight in a mountainous country against an army historically known to fight tooth and nail against any threat to its autonomy, that was also receiving military support from Britain. Now, the Kingdom of Greece was as equally unsuited for prolonged offensive as Italy was, owing to the fact that most of its own military was far from up to date and supplied by foreign manufacturers, and also lacked proper modern armour and aircraft, but had the benefit of a fierce sense of independence and a prolonged history of conflict with Italy. As the Italian Regia Aeronautica bombed Greek cities, the ground invasion almost immediately ground to a halt, brought on by an unexpected resistance by the Hellenic army, coupled with the rain and snow of having to fight some of the most rugged terrain in Europe. By the 9th of November 1940, it was clear that Mussolini's offensive had failed as the front line had come to a standstill, and it was at this point the Greek army launched their counterattack. Now, the exhausted Italian forces initially held their positions, they could not stop holes being punched into the lines as they were soon forced back towards Albania. Adolf Hitler denounced the move as a major strategic blunder, stating that Italy should have concentrated on North Africa, and that by attacking Greece, a country already friendly towards Britain, that Greece would become a danger to Hitler's southern flank and his plans for the east. As Australian forces captured Benghazi on the 6th of February 1941, British and Greek military and political officials met and discussed plans for the conduct of the war in the Balkans. Greece had initially asked Britain for 9 divisions plus armoured support to shore up their already beleaguered Hellenic defenders in case Germany became involved. However, that was something that just couldn't be delivered at the time due to the ongoing operations of 13 Corps in North Africa and the overall rebuilding of the British Army following the Dunkirk evacuation. In response, General Wavell offered a token force, which was rejected on the basis that the presence of any British troops on Greek soil would serve as justification to Germany to become involved, the very thing that they were designed to stop, and while Greece had 21 divisions filled at the time, almost all of them were engaged on the Albanian front, leaving only a token force on the Bulgarian frontier in case Germany came to the aid of their Italian ally. And the offered British force, which would have lacked the strength to resist the German thrust in itself from allied Bulgaria. Despite this, Greek authorities reaffirmed the British government of Greece's determination to resist the German attack and reiterated that British forces should only be sent to Macedonia if the German army entered Bulgaria, which was exactly what happened, as Hitler was using Bulgaria as a base to launch his invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, despite the absence of Allied troops on the ground, the fact that the Royal Air Force was flying sorties in Greece in support of their operations, and the Allies were supplying arms and equipment to the Hellenic army, and the fact that the Italians were steadily being pushed back across the Albanian border, Hitler finally decided to become involved on the 4th of November. His concern was that ongoing operations in the Balkans would present an actual threat to Romanian oil fields that could potentially also open up a southern European front, sapping his attention away from his operations against the Soviet Union. As the supply of British forces was finite at this point in the war, Churchill had attempted to court both neutral Turkey and Yugoslavia into joining the war on the side of the Allies, but was unable to secure the support of either for an Allied Balkan front. So instead, he turned to the only other resource he had available in the region, the Australian and New Zealand forces in North Africa. who had formed the bulk of the fighting forces smacking down Italy to support Greek operations. Now, understandably, the Prime Ministers of Australia and New Zealand, Sir Robert Menzies and Sir Peter Fraser, were less than thrilled with the idea of sending the Australian Imperial Force and New Zealand Expeditionary Force once again into the Aegean, in what they hoped was not going to be a repeat of the debacle of the Gallipoli campaign, and expressed that concern when they travelled to London in February for a conference with the British cabinet. Unfortunately, history likes to repeat itself. Now, both men were of the generation who was haunted with the stories of slaughter on the beaches of Anzac Cove for no gains at the urging of the then First Lord of the Admiralty, the same cigar-smoking gentleman who now occupied 10 Downing Street. Though technically Churchill had nothing to do with the land invasion of Gallipoli, that decision sits squarely on the shoulders of the First Sea Lord, Admiral John Fisher, and General Sir Ian Hamilton, the commander of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force during the First World War. Despite the misgivings of both Menzies and Fraser, both men would give their assent to redeploying their forces to Greece, and on the 2nd of March, the British launched Operation Lusture, deploying the so-named Lusture Force, comprising of the 6th and newly arrived 7th Australian Divisions, the 2nd New Zealand Division, and the British 1st Armoured Brigade to Greece. Originally, the plan called for the newly raised 9th Australian Division to join the 7th Division and leave the 6th in North Africa to defend the territory taken by the Allies. However, the Australian commander of the Australian Imperial Force, Lieutenant General Thomas Blamey, insisted that the 6th was his only trained, experienced, and fully equipped division, and it should be the first to go to Greece alongside the 7th, and to leave the inexperienced 9th on garrison duty to train. Now, to answer the question of why the first unit of the second raising of the Australian Imperial Force was labelled the 6th Australian Division, the reasoning is that during the First World War, Australia raised 5 divisions, numbered 1 to 5, and in 1921, when that Australian Imperial Force was disbanded, the decision was made that the Citizens Military Force, colloquially known as the militia, would be reorganised along the lines of the AIF to maintain the legacies of the units who fought in the Great War. And as the 1903 Defence Act prohibited established military units from being involved overseas, the first 5 divisions were reclassified as reserve divisions and tasked with home defence, which meant that the units of the second raising of the Australian Imperial Force were sequentially numbered from 6 to 9, with another 3 divisions of the militia being numbered 10, 11 and 12. The 6th, 7th and 9th were deployed to North Africa, while the 8th was sent to Singapore to free up territorial troops for Britain. Ironically, the 1st Australian Imperial Force actually did raise a 6th Division during the closing stages of the Great War, however it came during the manpower shortage and never actually saw action and thus didn't have a legacy to uphold. On the 1st of March 1941, the 2nd First had received orders to prepare to move to an unknown destination overseas and moved to Alexandria. By the 7th of March, Travers and the rest of the 2nd First were on the Egyptian-Libyan border at Sollum, and the 15th would find them back at a Kingi Marriott outside Alexandria, where they'd be issued with Thompson submachine guns and treated to a beleaguered Christmas dinner. While also in Alexandria, Travers came down with sandfly fever, a common but non-lethal disease spread by sandflies endemic to countries around the Mediterranean, and as a result was able to get a week's leave in Cairo, where he was able to meet up once more with his wife. Unfortunately, this reunion was cut short, as on the 17th of March, all leave was cancelled and guards were sent to Alexandria to return all men to barracks. As Travers was in Cairo, he was apparently informed by Commanding General Sir Thomas Blamey that he had to return to Alexandria, and hurriedly farewelling his wife, climbed into a taxi and raced the 150 miles back to Alexandria. As, on the following day, the 2nd First, with the rest of the 16th Brigade, boarded the transports SS Bankura and SS Ionic, bound for Greece. They would arrive in the chief port in Athens, Piraeus, on the 22nd of March, and entered camp at Daphne, roughly 10 miles northwest of Athens. 4 days later, the 16th Brigade entrained for Larissa, arriving on the 26th. From there, they travelled further north to Servia. Within a week, the battalion had swapped the desert of North Africa for the snow-capped mountains of Greece. And on the eve of Germany's involvement in the Balkan front, the 2nd First crossed the Alkimon River to man positions on the Vera Pass. On the 6th of April 1941, German forces simultaneously attacked Greece and Yugoslavia, including a devastating air attack on Piraeus. The following day, the 2nd First occupied positions around Lividero at Varoya on the 7th of April to defend the Larissa transport hub from the German line of advance. In doing so, they became part of the reformed Anzac Corps. The other forces in their immediate area was the New Zealand 5th Brigade. All these units would have less than a week to dig in and prepare, as Anzac positions on the Mount Olympus defensive line would be attacked by German forces on the 14th of April. Fortunately for Travers, according to his own account in an interview given in 2003, when the Germans advanced towards Athens, they did so bypassing the positions of the 2nd First, as they could not get into defensive positions to attempt to resist them. On the 15th, Travers and the rest of the 2nd First lost contact with their brigade and divisional commands owing to the difficult terrain, weather, and ever-present German Luftwaffe. As a result of the German advance, the Allies lost the initiative and never regained it. Yugoslavia capitulated quickly, cutting the Greek supply line to its forces on the Italian front, and within a week, the Allied forces were in retreat. The campaign was now hindered by poor communication between the Greek and British commands and the primitive road and rail system in Greece, plus the difficult terrain and the speed and success of the German advance. Lieutenant General John Coates has summed up the campaign thusly, quote, "Yet, as in almost every Allied campaign in the early part of the war, the worst mistakes of the politicians and the strategists were moderated by the bravery, fighting qualities, and sheer dogged determination of the troops. Greece was no exception," unquote. The New Zealand Brigade had been told to hold their positions until the 16th of April to slow the German advance before withdrawing further inland. The same day, a party from the 2nd First set out to try and re-establish contact with their own brigade headquarters, only to find that orders to withdraw had also been issued to the 2nd First, but according to the unit diary, quote, "QM informed Lieutenant Fairbairn that we should have been withdrawn the night before, but brigade had been unable to locate unit with orders," unquote. As the units on their flanks had already been withdrawn, groups of troops were given rations and told to make their way back down the mountains to Leverdon, and according to Travers, it took 3 days for the withdrawal order to reach the entirety of the 2nd First. En route to Leverdon, they linked up with the New Zealand 21st Battalion and covered the retreat of their brother soldiers in the New Zealand Division before making their own way south. While B Company 2nd First participated in the Battle of Pineus Gorge on the 18th of April, along with a composite force known as Anzac Force, comprising of the 2nd, 2nd, and 2nd Third Battalions, along with the 21st New Zealand Battalion, conducted a rearguard action to try and stall German forces crossing the Pineus River in their attempt to cut off the transport hub of Larissa, where the main body of Anzacs were funneling through down to the south. The remainder of the battalion were exhausted from serious mountaineering the days before, and in an attempt to outmaneuver the German mountaineer regiments, attempted several steep ascents and descents over the previous days. They were in Larissa, tasked with defending the aerodrome from a suspected German paratrooper drop, and as this didn't manifest during the battle, they rested in an abandoned factory. One of the several issues plaguing the British forces was that they were almost fully motorized. Now, this was something that their allies and opponents in the theatre weren't, and that ironically made them more adaptable to the terrain issues they were facing. This, coupled with the poor port, road, and rail infrastructure of Greece at the time, greatly impacted upon the effectiveness of Lusture force. And unfortunately, the force was already outnumbered by the 2 German armies who were steamrolling their way down towards the Adriatic at exactly the same time that German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched his Africa Corps offensive, pushing through Benghazi and forcing the 9th Division to withdraw and the 7th Division to be released from Lusture force to shore up the defense at Tobruk, which led to the famous siege. This move took the already understrength force out at the knees, as no additional forces could be sent as reinforcements. What was already in Greece was all the support they were going to get. On the 18th, while still holding the aerodrome, the 2nd First received orders to withdraw to the Lamia Pass, and as they were about to depart, they received new orders to take up defensive positions outside Larissa, as German forces had broken through the Pineus Gorge, and the men were told to expect German armour. Interestingly though, an hour later the orders were rescinded, and the Australian forces formed up and moved south as initially ordered. Travelling during the day presented their own perils as they became vulnerable to Luftwaffe dive bomber attacks, and they had to painstakingly make their way through cratered roads and burned out vehicles. At this point, the Allied forces were in full retreat. Due to operational requirements, when the 2nd First arrived at Lamia, it came under the command of the 19th Australian Infantry Brigade, who had been tasked to defend the Calendaran Pass as the New Zealand forces held the Thermopylae Pass to the east. On the 20th, German forces reached the outskirts of Lamia, roughly 15 kilometres from the defensive line. As the New Zealand forces withdrew, orders came forward stating there would be no further withdrawals. The real battle for Greece was about to occur. To quote General Vasey, who had been appointed commander of the 19th Brigade before the transit to Greece, as quoted from David Horner's General Vasey's War, quote, upon being told to hold, he replied, "Here you bloody well are, and here you bloody well stay. And if any bloody German gets between your post and the next, turn your bloody Bren around and shoot him up the arse," unquote. The fight to hold the Australian position started on the 21st, with Australian forces holding until the 22nd, when Vasey received orders that Greece was to be evacuated, and the 6th Division was to be withdrawn, with the 19th Brigade holding a rearguard operation at the Thermopylae Pass until Anzac Day Eve. If the comparisons between the 300 Spartans and the approximate 225 Australian soldiers holding the line against an overwhelmingly superior enemy force weren't there before this order was given, it definitely was afterwards. By the 24th, the 2nd 1st and 2nd 11th were fighting in support of each other, with Captain William Travers and Captain Ralph Honor each participating in the final rearguard operations as the Allied forces made their way to ports to evacuate. The 2nd 1st was ordered to Megara, to the west of Athens, and to hide while waiting for transport. As the exhausted survivors of the 2nd 1st clambered up the nets to the transport ship Thurland Castle and the destroyer HMS Rheineck on Anzac Day 1941, the Greek campaign reached its inevitable tragic end. In total, the 2nd 1st sustained 120 officers and other ranks killed, missing, or taken prisoner. And in the next episode, Travers and his men would face their toughest fight yet, as by 0200 on the morning of the 26th of April 1941, the 2nd 1st, along with the rest of the survivors from Greece, were sailing to Crete. The one thing the 2nd 1st had over most of their brother units of the 6th Division was that it possessed almost all of its weapons and ammunition, save for their mortars. One fortunate side effect of being bypassed the German forces, I guess. And when we return, those arms will prove invaluable for the defense of Crete. And there you have it, folks. That is part 1 of the life, service, and legacy of Captain William Holmes Travers. Next episode, we'll continue with Travers' involvement in the disastrous Crete campaign. References cited in this episode are the History Guild website, entries on the 2nd 1st Australian Infantry Battalion, the Virtual War Memorial Australia's website entry on the 2nd 1st Australian Infantry Battalion and on Captain William Holmes Travers, the Anzacs of Greece website, the Australian Department of Veterans Affairs Anzac portal page on Greece and Crete, April-May 1941, the Department of Veterans Affairs Greece and Crete information page, the National Archive of Australia, the service record of William Holmes Travers, the Western Desert Campaign 1940 to 1941 by Glenn Wallet, the German Campaigns of the Balkans Spring 1941 by the Center of Military History United States Army, the Battle of Penis Gorge, a study of a broken Anzac Brigade by Craig Stockings in the Australian Army Journal, the unit diaries of the 2nd 1st Australian Infantry Battalion and the 16th Australian Infantry Brigade, the official history of Australia's involvement in the War of 1939 to 1945, the Australians at War Film Archive interview with William Travers, the online newspaper archive Trove by the National Library of Australia, The Good Soldier by Field Marshal Earl Wavell, Italy Invades Greece from the History Channel website, the Greco-Italian War entry from the Sabaton website, of all places, and the website of the Australian War Memorial. I was only doing my job, and the Australian Military History Podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support from each and every one of you, but especially to the members of our Armoured Emu Brigade community. Now, if you want to continue the conversation or suggest the topic for a future episode, you can do so on all our social media channels. At this point, the podcast is on everything under @IWODMJ. Links to everything are in the show description. If you want to join the Armoured Emu Brigade community, you can also do so on our Discord server. The invite link to that is on the episode description and on the podcast website, www.thecnetwork.net. There you can find also show notes, transcripts, and photos of my various travels that are locating the myriad of memorials dotted around Australia. If you like what I do here on the podcast and want to directly support the work that I do, you can either buy the podcast a one-off coffee or support us on Patreon for exclusive podcasts, interviews, and giveaways. Each cent raised goes directly into improving the podcast, from digitization of service records and the purchasing of reference material to the distribution and licensing of each and every piece of content. But the best thing you can do is rate this episode on your platform of choice, leave a review, or share it with a friend. It's the easiest way to show your support and get the show into the ears of people who need to hear it. Thanks for listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian Military History Podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast is mostly a one-man show, with me doing the writing, researching, recording, audio engineering, and directing, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not represent the opinions or views of any agency, entity, or organization. It is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike 4.0 International License. And until next time, friends, catch you then. Bye.